The Return, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Reynard. The Return, by H. Beam Piper and John J. McGuire. Chapter 1. Altamont cast a quick, routine glance at the instrument panels, and then looked down through the transparent nose of the helicopter at the yellow-brown river 500 feet below. Next, he scraped the last morsel from his plate and ate it. "What did you make this out of, Jim?" he asked. "I hope you kept notes while you were concocting it. It's good." "The 2 smoked pork chops left over from yesterday evening," Loudons said, "and that bowl of rice that's been taking up space in the refrigerator the last couple of days, together with a little edge powder and some milk. I ground the chops up and mixed them with the rice and the other stuff, then added some bacon to make grease to fry it in." Altamont chuckled. That was Loudons, all right. He could take a few leftovers, mess them together, pop them in the skillet, and have a meal that would turn the chef back at the fort green with envy. He filled his cup and offered the pot. "Calf choc?" he asked. Loudons held his cup out to be filled, blew on it, sipped, and then hunted on the ledge under the desk for the butt of the cigar he had half smoked the evening before. "Did you ever drink coffee, Monty?" the socio-psychologist asked, getting the cigar drawing to his taste. "Coffee? No, I've read about it, of course. We'll have to organize an expedition to Brazil sometime to get seeds and try raising some." Loudons blew a smoke ring towards the rear of the cabin. "A much overrated beverage," he replied. "We found some once when I was on that expedition into Idaho in what must have been the stockroom of a hotel. Vacuum packed in moisture-proof containers and free from radioactivity. It wasn't nearly as good as calf choc. But then, I suppose, a pre-bust-up coffee drinker couldn't stomach this stuff we're drinking." Loudons looked forward up the river they were following. "Get anything on the radio?" he asked. "I noticed you took us up to about 10,000 while I was shaving." Altamont got out his pipe and tobacco pouch, filling the former slowly and carefully. "Not a whisper. I tried Colony 3 in the Ozarks, and I tried to call in that tribe of workers in Louisiana. I couldn't get either." "Maybe if we tried to get a little more power on the set." That was Loudons too, Altamont thought. There wasn't a better man at the fort when it came to dealing with people, but confront him with a problem about things and he was lost. That was one of the reasons why he and the stocky, phlegmatic social scientist made such a good team, he thought. As far as he himself was concerned, people were just a mysterious, exasperatingly unpredictable order of things which were subject to no known natural laws. And Loudons thought the same thing about machines. He couldn't psychoanalyze them. Altamont gestured with his pipe toward the nuclear electric conversion unit, between the control cabin and the living quarters in the rear of the boxcar-sized helicopter. "We have enough power back there to keep this windmill in the air 24 hours a day, 365 days a year for the next 15 years, he said. "We just don't have enough radio. If I'd step up the power in this set any more, it'd burn out before I could say, 'Altamont calling Fort Ridgeway.'" "How far are we from Pittsburgh now?" Loudons wanted to know. Altamont looked across the cabin at the big map of the United States as they had been, the red and green and blue and yellow patchwork of vanished political divisions. The colours gleamed through the transparent overlay on which this voyage of rediscovery was plotted. The red line of their journey started at Fort Ridgeway, in what had been Arizona. It angled east by a little north to Colony 3, in northern Arkansas, sharply northeast to St. Louis and its lifeless ruins, then to Chicago and Gary, where little bands of Stone Age reversions stalked and fought and ate each other. Detroit, where things that had completely forgotten they were human emerged from their burrows only at night. Cleveland, where a couple of cobalt bombs must have landed in the lake and drenched everything with radioactivity that still lingered after 2 centuries. Akron, where vegetation was only beginning to break through the glassy slag. Cincinnati, where they had last stopped. "How's the leg doing this morning, Jim?" he asked. "Little stiff, doesn't hurt much though." "Why, we're about 50 miles as we follow that river, and that's relatively straight." He looked down through the transparent nose of the copter at a town, now choked with trees that grew among the tumbled walls. "I think that's Alikippa." Loudons looked and shrugged, then looked again and pointed. "There's a bear, just ducked into that church or movie theatre or whatever. I wonder what he thinks we are." Altamont puffed slowly at his pipe. "I wonder if we're going to find anything at all in Pittsburgh." "You mean people, as distinct from those biped beasts we found so far?" "I doubt it," Loudons replied, finishing his calf choc and wiping his moustache with the back of his hand. "I think the whole eastern half of the country is nothing but forest like this, and the highest type of life is just about 3 cuts below Homo neanderthalensis, almost impossible to contact and even more impossible to educate." "I wasn't thinking about that. I've just about given hope of finding anybody or even a reasonably high level of barbarism," Altamont said. "I was thinking about that cache of microfilmed books that was buried at the Carnegie Library." "If it was buried," Loudons qualified, "all we have is that article and that 2-century-old copy of Time about how the people at the library had constructed the crypt and were beginning the microfilming. We don't know if they ever had a chance to get it finished before the rocket started landing." They passed over a dam of flotsam that had banked up at a wrecked bridge and accumulated enough mass to resist the periodic floods that had kept the river usually clear. 3 human figures fled across the sandflat at one end of it and disappeared into the woods. 2 of them carried spears tipped with something that sparkled in the sunlight, probably shards of glass. "You know, Monty, I get nightmares sometimes thinking about what things must be like in Europe," Loudons said. 5 or 6 wild cows went crashing through the brush below. Altamont nodded when he saw them. "Maybe tomorrow we'll let down and shoot a cow," he said. "I was looking in the freeze locker, and the fresh meat's getting a little low. Or a wild pig, if we find a good stand of oak trees. I could enjoy what you do with some acorn-fed pork." He looked across the table. "Finished?" he asked Loudons. "Take over then, I'll go back and wash the dishes." They rose, and Loudons, favouring his left leg, moved over to the seat at the controls. Altamont gathered up the 2 cups, the stainless steel dishes, and the knives and the forks and spoons, going up the steps, over the shielded converter, and ducking his head to avoid the seat in the forward top machine gun turret. He washed and dried the dishes, noting with satisfaction that the gauge of the water tank was still reasonably high, and glanced out one of the windows. Loudons was taking the big helicopter upstairs for a better view. Now and then, among the trees, there would be a glint of glassy slag, usually a fairly small circle. That was to be expected. Beside the 3 or 4 H-bombs that had fallen on the Pittsburgh area mentioned in the transcripts of the last news to breach the fort from the outside, the whole district had been pelted, more or less at random, with fission bombs. West of the confluence of the Allegheny and the Monongahela, it would probably be worse than this. "Can you see Pittsburgh yet, Jim?" he called out. "Yes, it's a mess. Worse than Gary, worse than Akron even." "Monty, come here, I think I have something." Picking up the pipe he had laid down, Altamont hurried forward, dodging his 6-foot length under the gun turret and swinging down from the walkway over the converter. "What is it?" he asked. "Smoke, a lot of smoke. 20 or 30 fires at the very least. Loudons had shifted from forward to hover, and was peering through a pair of binoculars. "See that island, the long one? Across the river from it, on the north side, toward this end. Yes, by Einstein, and I can see cleared ground, and what I think are houses. Inside a stockade." Chapter 2. Murray Hughes walked around the corner of the cabin into the morning sunlight, lacing his trousers, with his hunting shirt thrown over his bare shoulders. He found, without much surprise, that his father had also slept late. Verner Hughes was just beginning to shave. Inside the kitchen, his mother and the girls were clattering pots and skillets. Outside the kitchen door, his younger brother, Hector, was noisily chopping wood. Going through the door, he filled another of the light metal basins with hot water, found his razor, and went outside again, setting the basin on the bench. Most of the ware in the Hughes cabin was of light metal. Murray and his father had mined it at the Dead City up the river, from a place where it had floated to the top of a puddle of slag, back when the city had been blasted at the end of the hard times. It had been hard work, but the stuff had been easy to carry down to where they had hidden their boat, and, for once, they'd had no trouble with the scourers. Too bad they couldn't say as much for yesterday's hunting trip. As he rubbed lather into the stubble on his face, he cursed with irritation. That had been a bad luck hunt all round. They had gone out before dawn, hunting into the hills to the north. They spent the day at it, and shot one small wild pig. Lucky it was small at that. They'd have had to abandon a fuller-grown one, after the scourers had begun hunting them. 6 of them, as big a band as he'd ever seen together at one time, had managed to cut them off from the stockade. He and his father had been forced to circle miles out of their way. His father had shot one, and he'd had to leave his hatchet sticking in the skull of another when his rifle had misfired. That meant a trip to the gunsmith's for a new hatchet and to have the mainspring of the rifle replaced. Nobody could afford to have a rifle that couldn't be trusted, least of all a hunter and a prospector. On top of everything else, he had had a few words with Alex Barrett, the gunsmith, the other day. Well, at least that could be smoothed over. Barrett would be glad to do business with him once the gunsmith saw that hard tool steel he had dug out of that place down the river. Hardest steel either he or his father had ever found, and it hadn't been atom spoiled either. He cleaned, wiped, and stropped his razor, and put it back in the case. He threw out the wash water on the compost pile, and went into the cabin, putting on his shirt and his belt. Then he passed through to the front porch, where his father was already eating at the table. The people of the Toon liked to eat in the open. It was something they'd always done, just as they'd always liked to eat together in the evenings. He sweetened his cup of chicory with a lump of maple sugar, and began to sip it before he sat down, standing with one foot on the bench and looking down across the parade ground, past the HQ house, toward the river and the wall. "If you're coming round to Alex's way of thinking, and mine, it won't hurt you to admit it, son," his father said. Murray turned, looking at his father with the beginning of anger, and then he grinned. The elders were constantly keeping the young men alert with these tests. He checked back over his actions since he had come out onto the porch. To the table, sugar in his chicory, 1 foot on the bench, which had reminded him again of the absence of the hatchet from his belt, and brought an automatic frown. Then the glance toward the gunsmith's shop, and across the parade ground, the glance including the house into which so much labour had gone, the wall that had been built from rubble and topped with pointed stakes, the white slabs of marble that marked the graves of the first tenant and the men of the old Toon. He had thought, at that moment, that maybe his father and Alex Barrett and Reader Rawson and Tenant Mycroft Jones and the others were right. There were too many things here that could not be moved along with them if they decided to move. It would be false modesty, refusal to see things as they were, not to admit that he was the leader of the younger men, and the boys of the irregulars. He had been forced to face the responsibilities of that fact since last winter. Then, the usual theological arguments about the proper order of the sacred books and the true nature of the Risen One had been replaced by a violent controversy when Sholto Jimenez and Birdie Edwards had reopened the old question of the advisability of moving the tune and settling elsewhere. He had been in favour of the idea himself, and found that the other young men had followed his lead, but for the last month or so he had begun to doubt the wisdom of it. It was probably reluctance to admit this to himself that had brought on the strained feelings between himself and his old friend the gunsmith. "I'll have to drill the irregulars today," he said. "Birdie Edwards has been drilling them while we've been hunting, but I'll go up and see Alex about a new hatchet and fixing my rifle. I'll have a talk with him." He stepped forward toward the edge of the porch, still munching on a honey-dipped piece of cornbread, and glanced up at the sky. That was a queer bird. He had never seen a bird with wing action like that. Then he realized that the object was not a bird at all. His father was staring at it too. "Murray, that's like the old stories from the time of the wars." But Murray was already racing across the parade ground toward the HQ house, where the big iron ring hung by its chain from a gallows-like post, with a hammer beside it. Chapter 3. The stockaded village became larger. Details grew plainer as a helicopter came slanting down and began spiralling around it. It was a fairly big place, some 40 or 50 acres in a rough parallelogram, surrounded by a wall of vari-coloured stone and brick and concrete rubble from old ruins, topped with a palisade of pointed poles. There was a small jetty projecting into the river, to which 6 or 8 boats of different sorts were tied. A gate opened onto this from the wall. Inside the stockade, there were close to 100 buildings, ranging from small cabins to a structure with a belfry. It seemed to have been a church, partly ruined in the war of 2 centuries ago and later rebuilt. A stream came down from the woods, across the cultivated land around the fortified village. There was a rough flume which carried the water from a dam close to the edge of the forest and provided a fall to turn a mill wheel. "Look, strip farming," Ludens pointed. "See the alternate strips of grass and ploughed ground? These people understand soil conservation. They have horses too." As he spoke, 3 riders left the village at a gallop. They separated, and the people in the fields, who had all started for the village, turned and began hurrying toward the woods. 2 of the riders headed for a pasture in which cattle had been grazing, and started herding them also into the woods. For a while there was a scurrying of little figures in the village below. Then, not a moving thing was in sight. "There's good organisation," Ludens said. "Everybody seems to know what to do, and how to get it done promptly. Look how neat the whole place is, policed up. I'll bet anything we'll find that they have a military organisation, or a military tradition at least." "We'll have a lot to find out. You can't understand a people until you understand their background and their social organisation." "Humph. Let me have a look at their artifacts. That will tell what kind of people they are," Altamont said, swinging the glasses back and forth over the enclosure. "Water power mill. Water power sawmill. Building on the left side of the water wheel. See the pile of fresh lumber beside it? Blacksmith shop, and from that chimney I'd say a small foundry too. Wonder what that little building out on the tip of the island is. It has a water wheel too, undershot wheel, and it looks like it could be raised or lowered. Now, I wonder... Monty, I think we ought to land right in the middle of the enclosure, on that open plaza thing, in front of the building that looks like a reconditioned church. That's probably the Royal Palace, or the Pentagon, or the Kremlin, or whatever. Altamont started to object, paused, and then nodded. I think you're right, Jim. From the way they scattered and got their livestock into the woods, they probably expect us to bomb them. We have to get inside, and that's the quickest way to do it. He thought for a moment. We'd better be armed when we go out. Pistols, auto carbines, and a few of those concussion grenades in case we have to break up a concerted attack. I'll get them. The plaza, the houses and the cabins around it, the 200-year-old church, all were silent and apparently lifeless as they set the helicopter down. Once Ludens caught a movement inside the door of a house and saw a metallic glint. There's a gun up there, he said. Looks like a 4-pounder, brass. I knew that Smith shop was also a foundry. See that little curl of smoke? That's the gunner's slow match. I thought maybe that thing on the island was a powder mill. That would be where they'd put it. Probably extract their niter from the dung of their horses and cows. Sulphur, probably from the coal mine drainage. Jim, this is really something. I hope they don't cut loose with that thing, Ludens said, looking apprehensively at the brass-rimmed black muzzle that was covering them from the belfry. I wonder if we ought to... Oh, here they come. 3 or 4 young men stepped out of the wide door of the old church. They wore fringed buckskin trousers and buckskin shirts, and odd caps of deerskin with visors to shade the eyes, and similar beaks behind to protect the neck. They had powder horns and bullet pouches slung over their shoulders, and long rifles in their hands. They stepped aside as soon as they were out, carefully avoiding any gesture of menace. They simply stood, watching the helicopter which had landed in their village. 3 other men followed them out. They too wore buckskins and the odd double-visored caps. One had a close-cropped white beard, and on the shoulders of his buckskin shirt he wore the single silver bars of a first lieutenant of the vanished United States Army. He had a pistol on his belt. The pistol had the saw-handled grip of an automatic, but it was a flintlock, as were the rifles of the young men who stood so watchfully on either side of the door. 2 middle-aged men accompanied the bearded man, and the trio advanced toward the helicopter. All right, come on, Monty. Ludens opened the door and let down the steps. Picking up an auto carbine, he slung it and stepped out of the helicopter, Altamont behind him. They advanced to meet the party from the church, halting when they were about 20 feet apart. I must apologize, Lieutenant, for dropping in on you so unceremoniously. Ludens stopped, wondering if the man with the white beard understood a word of what he was saying. The natural way to come in when you travel in the air, the old man replied. At least you came in openly. I can promise you a better reception than you got at the city to the west of us a couple of days ago. Now, how did you know that we had trouble in the day before yesterday? Ludens demanded. The old man's eyes sparkled with childlike pleasure. That surprises you, my dear sir. In a moment, I dare say you'll be surprised at the simplicity of it. You have a nasty rip in the left leg of your trousers, and the cloth around it is stained with blood. Through the rip, I perceive a bandage. Obviously, you have suffered a recent wound. I further observe that the side of your flying machine bears recent scratches, as though from the spears or throwing hatchets of the scourers. Evidently, they attacked you as you were landing. It is fortunate that these cannibal devils are too stupid and too anxious for human flesh to exercise patience. Well, that explains how you knew we'd recently been attacked, Ludens told him. But how did you guess that it had been to the west of here, in a ruined city? I never guess, the oldster with the silver bar and the keystone-shaped red patch on his left shoulder replied. It is a shocking habit, destructive to the logical faculties. What seems strange to you is only so because you do not follow my train of thought. For example, the wheels and their framework under your flying machine are splashed with mud, which seems to be predominantly brick dust, mixed with plaster. Obviously, you landed recently in a dead city, either during or after a rain. There was a rain here yesterday evening, the wind being from the west. Obviously, you followed behind the rain as it came up the river, and now that I look at your boots, I see traces of the same sort of mud around the soles and in front of the heels. But this is heartless of us, keeping you standing here on a wounded leg, sir. Come in and let our medic take a look at it. Well, thank you, Lieutenant, Ludens replied. But don't bother your medic. I've attended to the wound myself, and it wasn't serious to begin with. You are a doctor? The white-haired man asked. Of sorts. A sort of general scientist. My name is Ludens. My friend, Mr. Altamont here, is a scientist too. There was an immediate reaction. All three of the elders of the village, and the young riflemen who had accompanied them, exchanged glances of surprise. Ludens dropped his hand to the grip of his slung auto-carbine, and Altamont sidled away from his partner, his hand moving as if by accident toward the butt of his pistol. The same thought was in both men's minds, that these people might feel, as the heritage of the war of 2 centuries ago, a hostility to science and scientists. There was no hostility, however, in their manner, as the old man came forward with outstretched hand. I am Lieutenant Mycroft Jones, the Toon leader here, he said. This is Stamford Rawson, our reader, and Verner Hughes, our Toon Sarge. This is his son, Murray Hughes, the Toon Sarge of the Irregulars. But come into the HQ house, gentlemen. We have much to talk about. By this time, the villagers had begun to emerge from the log cabins and rubble-walled houses around the plaza and the old church. Some of them, mostly the young men, were carrying rifles, but the majority were unarmed. About half of them were women, in short deerskin skirts or homespun dresses. There were a number of children, the younger ones almost completely naked. Sarge, the old man told one of the youths, post a guard over this flying machine. Don't let anybody meddle with it, and have all the non-coms and techs report here on the double. He turned and shouted up at the truncated steeple. Atherton, sound all clear. A horn up in the belfry began blowing, apparently to advise the people who had run from the fields into the forest that there was no danger. They went through the open doorway of the old stone church and entered the big room inside. The building had evidently once been gutted by fire, 2 centuries ago, but portions of the wall had been restored. The floor had been replaced by one of rough planks, and there was a plank ceiling at about 10 feet. The room was apparently used as a community centre. There were a number of benches and chairs, all very neatly made, and along one wall, out of the way, 10 or 15 long tables had been stacked, the tops in a pile and the trestles on the tops. The walls were decorated with trophies of weapons, a number of M12 rifles and M16 submachine guns, all in good, clean condition, a light machine rifle, 2 bazookas. Among them were cruder weapons, stone and metal-tipped spears and clubs, the work of the wild men of the woods. A stairway led to the second floor, and it was up this stairway that the man who bore the title of Toon Leader conducted them to a small room furnished with a long table, a number of chairs, and several big wooden chests bound with iron. Sit down, gentlemen, the Toon Leader invited, going to a cupboard and producing a large bottle stoppered with a corn cob and a number of small cups. "It's a little early in the day," he went on, "but this is a very special occasion. You smoke a pipe, I take it?" he asked Altamont. "Then try some of this, of our own growth and curing." He extended a doeskin moccasin, which seemed to be the tobacco container. Altamont looked at the thing dubiously, then filled his pipe from it. The oldster drew his pistol, pushed a little wooden plug into the vent, added some tow to the priming, and, aiming at the wall, snapped it. Evidently, at time the formality of plugging the vent had been overlooked. There were a number of holes in the wall there. This time, however, the pistol didn't go off. The old man shook out the smouldering tow, blew it into flame, and lit a candle from it, offering the light to Altamont. Loudons got out a cigar and lit it from the candle. The others filled and lighted pipes. The Toon Leader reprimed his pistol, then holstered it, took off his belt and laid it aside, an example the others followed. They drank ceremoniously, and then seated themselves at the table. As they did, 2 more men entered the room. They were introduced as Alexander Barrett, the gunsmith, and Stanley Markovich, the distiller. The Toon Leader began by asking, "You come, then, from the west?" "Are you from Utah?" the gunsmith interrupted suspiciously. "Why, no, we're from Arizona, a place called Fort Ridgeway," Loudons said. The others nodded, in the manner of people who wish to conceal ignorance. It was obvious that none of them had ever heard of Fort Ridgeway, or Arizona either. "You say you come from a fort? Then the wars aren't over yet?" Sarge Hughes asked. "The wars have been over for a long time. You know how terrible they were. You know how few in all the countries were left alive," Loudons said. "None that we know of beside ourselves and the Scourers, until you came," the Toon Leader said. "We have found only a few small groups in the whole country who have managed to save anything of the old times. Most of them lived in little villages and cultivated land. A few had horses or cows. None that we have ever found before made guns and powder for themselves. But they remembered that they were men and did not eat one another. Whenever we find a group of people like this, we try to persuade them to let us help them." "Why?" the Toon Leader asked. "Why do you do this for people that you have never met before? What do you want from them, from us, in return for your help?" He was speaking to Altamont rather than to Loudons. It seemed obvious that he believed Altamont to be the leader and Loudons the subordinate. "Because we are trying to bring back the best of the old times," Altamont told him. "Look, you have had troubles here. So have we, many times. Years when the crops didn't... He looked at Loudons, aware that his partner should be talking now, and also suddenly aware that Loudons had recognized the situation and left the leadership up to him. "Years that the crops failed. Years of storms, or floods. Troubles with those beast men in the woods." "And you were alone, as we were, with no one to help?" "We want to put all men who are still men in touch with one another, so that they can help each other in trouble, and work together. If this isn't done, everything that makes men different from beasts will soon be no more." "He's right. One of us alone is helpless," the Reader said. "It is only in the Toon that there is strength. He wants to organize a Toon of all Toons." "That's about it. We are beginning to make helicopters, like the one Loudons and I came in. We'll furnish your community with one or more of them. We can give you a radio so that you can communicate with other communities. We can give you rifles and machine guns and ammunition to fight the Scourers, did you call them? And we can give you atomic engines so that you can build machines for yourselves." "Some of our people.
Alex Barrett here, the gunsmith, and Stan Markovich, the distiller, and Harrison Grant, the ironworker, get their living by making things. How'd they make out after your machines came in here?" Verner Hughes asked.
"We've thought of that. We had that problem with other groups we've helped," Ludens said. "In some communities, everybody owns everything in common, so we don't have much of a problem. Is that the way you do it here?"
"Well, no. If a man makes a thing, or digs it out of the ruins, or catches it in the woods, it's his."
"Then we'll work out some way. Give the machines to the people who are already in a trade, or something like that. We'll have to talk it over with you, and with the people concerned."
"How is it you took so long finding us?" Alex Barrett asked. "It's been 200 or so years since the wars." "Alex, you see but you do not observe," the Toon leader rebuked. "These people have their flying machines, which are highly complicated mechanisms. They would have to make tools, and machines to make them, and tools and machines to make those tools and machines. They would have to find materials, often going in search of them. The marvel is not that they took so long, but that they did it so quickly."
"That's right," Altamont said. "Originally, Fort Ridgeway was a military research and development center. As the country became disorganized, the government set this project up to develop ways of improvising power and transportation and communication methods, and extracting raw materials. If they'd had a little more time, they might have saved the country. As it was, they were able to keep themselves alive and keep something like civilization going at the fort, while the whole country was breaking apart around them. Then, when the rockets stopped falling, they started to rebuild. Fortunately, more than half the technicians at the fort were women, so there was no question of them dying out. But it's only been in the last 20 years that we've been able to make nuclear electric engines, and this is the first time any of us have gotten east of the Mississippi." "How did your group manage to survive?" Ludens asked. "You call it the Toon. I suppose that's what the word platoon has become, with time. You were originally a military platoon?"
"Platoon!" the white-bearded man said. "Of all the unpardonable stupidities! Of course that's what it was. And the title tenant was originally lieutenant. I know that, though we have dropped all use of the first part of the word. But that should have led me, if I had used my wits, to deduce platoon from toon."
The tenant shook his head in dismay at the stupidity, and Ludens found himself forced to say, "One syllable like that could have come from many words." Chapter 4. The tenant smiled at Ludens and said, "Your courtesy does not excuse our stupidity. We know our history, and we should have identified the word accurately. Yes, we were originally a platoon of soldiers, 200 years ago, at the time when the wars ended. The old Toon and the first tenant were guarding POWs. And there, sir," to Ludens, "is a word we cannot trace. We have no idea what they were. In any event, the POWs were all killed by a big bomb, and the first tenant, Lieutenant Gilbert Dunbar, took his platoon and started to march to DC, where the government was. But there was no government anymore. They fought with people along the way. When they needed food, or ammunition, or animals to pull their wagons, they took them, and killed those who tried to prevent them. Other people joined the Toon, and when they found women they wanted, they took them. They did all sorts of things that would have been crimes if there had been any law. But since there was no law, it was obvious that they could do no crime. The first lieutenant kept his men together because he had the books. Each evening, at the end of each day's march, he read to his men out of them." Altamont knew, without looking at his associate, that Ludens would be inconspicuously jotting down notes. The last was an item the sociologist would be sure to record. The white-bearded tenant had pronounced that reference to a written testament in capital letters. The story was continuing. Finally, they came here. There had been a town here, but it had been burned and destroyed, and there were people camping in the ruins. Some of them fought and were killed. Others came in and joined the platoon. At first, they built shelters around this building and made this their fort. Then they cleared away the ruins and built new houses. When the cartridges for the rifles began to get scarce, they began to make gunpowder and new rifles like these we are using now to shoot without cartridges. Lieutenant Dunbar did this out of his own knowledge because there was nothing in the books about making gunpowder. The guns in the books are rifles and shotguns and revolvers and air guns. Except for the air guns, which we haven't been able to make, these all shot cartridges. As with your people, we did not die out because we too had women. Neither did we increase greatly. Too many were died or killed young. But several times we had to tear down the wall and rebuild it, to make room inside for more houses. And we've been clearing out a little more land for the fields each year. We still read and follow the teachings of the books. We have made laws for ourselves out of them. There was a silence, during which Altamont felt himself to be the focus of attention. Not obtrusively, but nonetheless insistently. However, this was Loudon's field, and Altamont preferred not to speak. "And we are waiting for the slain and risen one," Tenant Jones added, and there was no doubt that he was looking at Altamont intently. "It is impossible that he will not, sooner or later, deduce the existence of this community, if he has not done so already." Again the silence and lack of movement, broken by Loudon's this time, when he picked up the candle to relight his cigar. Mentally, Altamont thanked his partner. "Well, sir," the Toon leader changed the subject abruptly. "Enough of this talk about the past. If I understand rightly, it is the future in which you gentlemen are interested." He pushed back the cuff of his hunting shirt and looked at an old and worn wristwatch. 1100. We'll have lunch shortly. This afternoon you will meet the other people of the Toon, and this evening at 1800 we'll have a mess together. Then, when we have everyone together, we can talk over your offer to help us and decide what it is that you can give us that we can use. "You spoke, a while ago, of what you could do for us in return," Altamont said. He knew that now he would have to be the one to stress their original mission. Loudons would probably be so fascinated by this society that the sociologist might never remember the primary reason for coming to Pittsburgh. "There's one thing you can do, no further away than tomorrow, if you're willing." He had no time to wonder at the interchange of glances around the table before the Toon leader said, "And that is?" "In Pittsburgh, somewhere, there is an underground crypt full of books. Not printed and bound books, but spools of microfilm. Do you know what that is?" The men of the Toon shook their heads. Altamont continued. "They are spools on which strips of film are wound, and on which pictures have been taken of books, page by page. We can make other, larger pictures from them, big enough to read." "Oh, photographs which you can enlarge? I can understand that. You mean you can make many copies of them?" "That's right, and you shall have copies as soon as we can take the originals back to Fort Ridgeway, where we have the equipment for enlarging them. But while we have information which will help us to find the crypt where the books are, we will need help in getting it open." "Of course, this is wonderful. Copies of the books?" the reader exclaimed. "We thought that we had the only one left in the world." "Not just the books, Stanford. Other books," the Toon leader told him.
The books mentioned in the books. But of course we will help you. You have a map to show where they are?" "Not a map, just some information. But we can work out the location of the crypt." "A ritual," Stamford Rawson said happily. "Of course." End of Part 1 of The Return by H. Beam Piper.